Hello friends, this is Murtaza Hussain and I am going to present you ASP.NET MVC5. So let's get started and look at the today's agenda. We will learn in this lecture what is MVC, history of ASP.NET, what is wrong with ASP.NET Web Forms, introduction to ASP.NET MVC5, and at the end of this lecture, MVC5 Lifecycle. MVC, the Model View Controller, is an architectural pattern that separates an application into three main logical components. Let me explain to you architectural pattern here. The MVC is called a pattern just because it sets some rules and regulations to do coding and also how the request will be transferred from one module to another module. It is an architecture. It provides a base for making an architecture. Means it tells you how to break your application into different components and how will you name them physically. How will you manage your files and folders? So this MVC framework is an architectural pattern which covers both sides. Each of these components in MVC have been built to handle specific development aspects of an application, and those are model, the view, and the controller. The view, as its name suggests, it is a user interface. By using that interface, a user will interact with your website and trigger some actions, and those actions in MVC paradigm will be received and controlled by the controller. The controller is like a headquarter which processes different incoming and outgoing requests. Its duty is to handle whatever is coming from the view and whatever has been fetched from the model. Here you can also interact with the model. Model is a component which has the responsibility to deal with the underlying database, whether that database is MySQL or MS Project or Oracle. Model can also do communication with and get data from the other sources like XML schema or CSV file, and it sends back the required or requested data to the view if the request is coming to the view from the view, or the controller if controller had sent a request to do some actions and perform some or to fetch some data or to save some data into or from the database, onto or from the database. Now I am going to tell you about the history of ASP.NET. The ASP.NET Web Forms technology stack, this picture is depicting that. The .NET is a byproduct of the Microsoft. Microsoft had introduced it in the late 90s and early 20,000 century. The purpose of making this platform is to support multiple languages and to do a managed code. It was a landmark in its own right, and it was a brand new something which was introduced by Microsoft, which attained the attention of different developers. Microsoft, on top of this .NET platform, introduced ASP.NET, which supported different languages as it was on top of this layer. The purpose of making this ASP.NET was to host the .NET applications in IIS, Microsoft's web server product, letting you interact with HTTP requests and responses. After that, Microsoft made ASP.NET Web Forms on top of this ASP.NET layer. Basically, the ASP.NET Web Forms are a set of UI components, pages, buttons, grids, lists, etc. plus a stateful object-oriented GUI programming model. What Microsoft tried to achieve by building such kind of framework, Microsoft tried to attempt to hide two things: the HTTP and the HTML. The HTTP is a stateless protocol because it does not maintain the state if you move from one page to another page, or if you send requests from server to client or client to server. While HTML was newly introduced into the market as web was flourishing. The rules and regulations were set by W3C by Web Consortium in back 1990s. So, and most of the developers at that time were working on Windows application, which were desktop based, and most of them were not familiar with these two technologies. So in order to keep them hidden from the developers, Microsoft tried and made this platform and introduced ASP.NET Web Forms. They introduced it by modeling the user interface as a hierarchy of server-side control objects. Each control kept tracks of its own state across requests using the view state facility. The view state is or was a hidden field which contained the data of the elements on a web form, so that when the request goes to the server or comes from the server to the client, it can maintain the data back and forth of each cycle. And the controls provided by the ASP.NET Web Forms were able to keep track of their own state across requests, rendering themselves or itself as HTML when needed and automatically connecting client-side events. For example, a button click with a corresponding server-side event handler code. because ASP.NET claimed they are separating the concerns. They have kept the HTML separate while the coding separate, but it was just an illusion. In fact, Webforms is a giant abstraction layer designed to deliver a classic event-driven graphical user interface over the web, and they were provided to make a smooth transition of the developers who were used to work on the Windows forms on a desktop for a desktop machine, and they didn't work and know about HTTP requests and responses. So that you could think in terms of stateful UI, and Microsoft could seamlessly transition the army of Windows desktop developers into the new world of web applications. So these web forms made them easy and made them feel like they are working on the Windows form, because the interface was just like the Windows form, and on top of that very famous platform .NET. So they felt it like a home, and moved easily to the web making a paradigm. So let's see what was wrong and is wrong with the ASP.NET Web Forms. So let's think once again. What the traditional ASP.NET Web Forms provide. They are really very great. They are keeping your front view separate, and you can drag and drop the components on the design view, and a file will be made which is called which have an extension .aspx, and that file will contain the mixture of the HTML and the server-side controls, while on the other hand, this file will be linked with the CoreBehind, which will be a pure VB or .cs or any other .NET supported language. So in this way, the work will be done. But in reality, it is really very cumbersome and complicated, and it proved to be complicated for the developers and for the testers also. So let's see one by one different hurdles and the complications which are associated with the ASP.NET Web Forms. So first thing which comes into our mind is the view state, and the weight of the view state, which keeps on increasing when you send a request from client to server, and server sends back the request to the client. So in each and every journey, the view states become heavy, and the data can reach hundreds of kilobytes in even a modest web application, and it goes back and forth with every request, which ends up in slowing down the speed of the website and the response times, and increasing the bandwidth demands of the server, which is not good for an end user, because end user will not stay on the website if the website's response is very slow. They will move on to other websites, and you will start losing your business. So this was a problem. And the other problem which comes to our mind is page lifecycle, because the infrastructure, the way Microsoft had developed the web forms, that is very tightly coupled, and the mechanism for connecting client-side events with the server-side event handler code, part of the page lifecycle, can be extraordinarily complicated and delicate. Many of the developers who have worked on the web forms now, if you transfer your application from one machine to another machine, some event handlers mysteriously fail to execute, and you will surprise what happened, and you will have to click on the events once again to find them with the code behind event handlers on server side. So this is another problem. The other thing which I have talked here, so that was a false sense of separations of concerns. Yes, ASP.NET Web Forms code behind models provide a means to take applications code out of its HTML markup and into a separate code behind class. And this is really very good because it visually it gives you a separation of concerns. You are separating the two things and keeping the HTML to another file and keeping the code into another file and linking them together. But in reality, developers are encouraged to mix presentation code, for example, manipulating the server-side control tree with their application logic, for example, manipulating database data. In these, some monstrous code behind classes. The end result can be fragile and unintelligible and unmanageable code, and you will be stuck with the event driven kind of thing, and whenever the request will come, the whole page lifecycle will execute, and you will end up with a slow response, and you will have to manage the post back events and the other things, all the part of this. So the other problem with this false sense of separation of concerns arises is a limited control over the HTML. As I have said earlier, Microsoft tried to hide HTML and HTTP from the developers because these two technologies were very new for the developers who are working on the Windows applications for desktop machines. So they had introduced server controls which render themselves as HTML, but not necessarily the HTML you want. Surely, because in early versions of ASP.NET, the HTML output failed to meet the web standards. If you know about the era from 2003 onwards, HTML was very popular in those days, and the standards were very important. But the old versions of ASP.NET were unable to cope with such kind of standards. And whenever the result of server-side control you saw, that was just a mess up of the HTML. That's it. Unstandard and low standard code. So sometimes it was also not able to make good use of cascading style sheets, and server controls generated unpredictable and complex ID attributes, values that are hard to access in JavaScript. Very hard. You cannot predict what will happen next, and it was very cumbersome, very tiresome to manipulate a DOM object by using the JavaScript, because JavaScript provides a user-rich interface, and it is a need of the day. So these problems are much improved in recent web forms releases, but it can still be tricky to get the HTML you expect from these server-side controls. So it takes you to the leaky abstraction. They try to hide HTML and HTTP wherever possible. As you try to implement custom behaviors, you frequently fall out of the abstraction, which forces you to reverse engineer the post-back events mechanism or perform obtuse acts to make it generate the desired HTML. Plus, all this section can act as a frustrating barrier for the people who want to make some components, for the developers who want to participate, and for the competent developers, they were unable to cope with such kind to tackle such kind of issues. And low testability. It was also a nightmare for the testers who want to do automated testing. Automation is a need of the day. It is very important aspect of today's industry, software industry. So integration testing, unit testing, each and everything. The tightly coupled architecture, the design is unsuitable for such kind of testings. So Microsoft decided to implement the most famous MVC architectural pattern, and by mixing the tightness of both and up to date ideas of and techniques from the agile development, they try to make a new development framework. So ASP.NET MVC is a web development framework from Microsoft that combines the effectiveness and tightness of model view controller architecture pattern and the most up-to-date ideas and techniques from agile development. Agile development focuses on the work and the delivery of what the client has said instead of a too much documentation. It is an iterative plus incremental approach, and under the agile development, there are a lot of techniques available and in practice in at the software houses. So Microsoft introduced MVC and named it ASP.NET MVC and released different versions of ASP.NET MVC. And currently, I am discussing MVC5. 5 means version 5, and MVC6 version is going to be released very soon and in the market, and you can explore the more features of MVC 5 in the near future. MVC6 in the near future, while MVC5 focuses on version 5 focuses on different kind of new features introduced in this ASP.NET MVC, and those features are attribute routing. Attributes, if you know about, if you have worked with C Sharp, are the key, are the main players which make many things easy by just implementing on top of the function. And provides a meaning, provides and change the behaviors of that functions accordingly. So it is an easy to use in code and in line where the developer is working. You can just put those attributes on top of the function or within the pocket of the function. So Microsoft decided to introduce attribute routing. Routing is a mechanism to pass the request coming from the view to the controller. It is a mechanism to decompose a URL and make the segmentations of the URL into and according to the MVC pattern, MVC requirement. Also, the best parts of the existing ASP.NET platform were used to develop ASP.NET MVC. It is a complete alternative to traditional ASP.NET web forms, delivering advantages for all but the most trivial of web development projects. At the end, MVC 5 again, version 5, Lifecycle. This picture clearly divides the life cycle into two phases: the request and the response. So let's get started and look at how it works. So let's say a request has come first time. We will see and analyze whether the request has come first time. Yes. Okay. Fill the route. Fill the route means decompose the URL and find the components, controller, action method, and query strings or action data, and fill the route table so that these values can be used in future for invoking the relevant controllers and action methods and passing the data to them. Once the request table has been filled, the route will be fetched. This is the step number 2. And the URL routing module will be called. And also the route data will be passed to this URL routing module. Now, we know the composed and decomposed components and the parts of a URL and specifically. So, according to the decomposed parts and the segments of a URL, our request context will be created. This is the request number 3. And after that, an MVC handler will work and will be invoked, which in turn create an instance of the controller. This is the step number 4. And the last step of the request section. After this step, the response section starts. Once the controller instance is created, it will be executed and its relevant controller on the basis of the provided route data will be invoked. Here, the action will be executed. This is a step 5. Once the action is executed and processed by the controller and by the MVC framework, the result will be generated and sent back to the view on the browser. View might be a browser, view might be a partial view might be result, and this is the step number 6, and result might be a file, result might be a JSON result might be a redirect to another action, and result might be null. So different results will be generated. A JavaScript result can also be generated. So this is the complete life cycle of a request which has come from a web browser and generated or triggered by pressing any button or link. Let me show you a working example of MVC. I'm going to run a sample test application, and I have put a break on an edit action method, which you can see here, so that I may let you know that when we had saved or updated an existing record, an event will be fired accordingly. The page is loading as soon as as soon as it loads, I will show you the flow which I have discussed a few minutes ago. So here you can see a list. By default, let me trigger an event by clicking on this edit link. So I'm going to hit the button save. In result, you can see and a test controller has been called and its action method edit has been invoked. So I click and hit the continue so that you can see the end result. Here you can see Usman. I had changed it. So Usman has been updated. So this is the complete flow. Thank you. Lecture summary. In this lecture, we discussed about MVC, Model View Controller, and also learned about history of ASP.NET and discussed different problems in ASP.NET Web Forms. After that, I had informed you about the ASP.NET MVC5 and its life cycle. Okay guys, if you want to get your website and mobile application done, you can make contact us at info@solvesummit.com, solutionsummit@yahoo.com, and you can take a call from us. We will be happy to provide you and provide you our services and we will be happy to make a good website or a mobile application for your firm or for your personal use. Thank you very much.